At 7:26 hours on March 11, 1991, the Monroe County Emergency Communications Center received a call from Theresa Halpern, a 32-year-old housewife residing on East Winslow Road in Bloomington, Indiana. Her voice was flat, almost measured, as she told the dispatcher her husband wasn't breathing and felt cold. When paramedics arrived 7 minutes later, they found Richard David Halpern, aged 44, lying face-up in the master bedroom, sheets undisturbed, no visible trauma. His limbs were rigid. Paramedics pronounced him dead at 7:37 hours. Initial cause of death was presumed to be myocardial infarction, a natural heart attack. No autopsy was immediately ordered. To outside observers, the scene was unremarkable. Richard Halpern was a known figure in local business circles, founder and principal consultant of Halpern Distribution Strategies, a logistics firm specializing in route efficiency and inventory reduction. He'd built the business steadily since 1982, servicing mid-tier manufacturers across southern Indiana and parts of Kentucky. His colleagues described him as methodical, numbers-oriented, a stickler for detail. He traveled frequently, averaging 3 nights away per week, and was known for maintaining tight boundaries between personal and professional life. Theresa Halpern, by contrast, had no employment history after marriage. She had briefly attended Ivy Tech in 1978 before leaving to care for her terminally ill mother. After marrying Richard in April 1982, she maintained the household, attended church at South Union Chapel, and occasionally volunteered at the library. Friends later described her as polite, but not warm, and someone who liked control in small things, the towels, the pantry, what time dinner was. The couple had no children. For nearly 9 years, their domestic life remained uneventful. But interviews conducted in the aftermath of Richard's death revealed a pattern of creeping estrangement. Theresa had reportedly grown withdrawn in the last 18 months. She stopped attending church in early 1990. She turned down most invitations. Her sister, Marla Mowbray, told detectives that calls from Theresa became brief and paranoid. She always seemed like she was afraid someone was listening. In late October 1990, Richard confided in his longtime friend and accountant, Daniel Avery, that he was considering a legal separation. According to Avery, Richard had grown suspicious. "She doesn't argue," he reportedly said, "but she watches. Always watches." Richard noted small objects being moved then returned, mail opened and resealed, and a drawer in his office found unlocked despite being keyed. "I don't think she's stable," he allegedly said. "And I don't know how she'll take it if I leave." By January 1991, Theresa had begun contacting insurance companies. Monroe Mutual confirmed she placed a call on January 13 inquiring about the cash value of her husband's $278,000 life insurance policy. She was listed as the sole beneficiary. 2 weeks later, she ordered a bottle of concentrated digitalis purpurea, an herbal extract made from foxglove, used traditionally for heart failure in diluted doses. In high doses, it causes vomiting, slowed heart rate, arrhythmia, and sudden cardiac arrest. The bottle, purchased through a wellness mail-order catalog, was shipped to the Halpern residence on February 28. A cancelled check and shipping invoice confirmed the transaction. From February 21 through March 5, Theresa conducted at least 12 documented searches on the couple's shared computer involving terms such as digitalis dosage in men, herbal cardiac symptoms, and can you detect poison after death. Investigators later recovered this history from the machine's hard drive. There was no autopsy ordered at the time of Richard's death. That decision would soon become the center of a homicide investigation. When Richard Halpern died on March 11, 1991, the paperwork moved faster than the questions. His wife Theresa had already called the funeral home by mid-morning. She waived any memorial service, declined family visitation, and requested cremation within 48 hours. Staff at Fairview Mortuary noted her demeanor as efficient. No tears. No hesitation. It was precisely this composure that caught the first ripple of suspicion. Daniel Avery, Richard's longtime accountant and closest friend, received the news the same day. What unsettled him wasn't the shock. Richard had been under pressure for months, but the speed at which Theresa moved. On March 13, 2 days after the death, she contacted the law office that handled Richard's estate. She requested immediate access to life insurance documents and business assets, referencing her spousal entitlement. Attorney Joseph Eckersley, the firm's managing partner, felt the conversation lacked the tone of bereavement. She didn't ask how he died. She asked what she owned, he later told investigators. That same week, Avery reached out to Eckersley and shared something else. Richard had recently discussed altering his life insurance beneficiary, naming his sister instead of Theresa. The paperwork, however, was still incomplete. They made a call, not to emergency services, but to a detective they both trusted, Laura Kinney, Monroe County PD. Kinney had a background in fraud and domestic investigations. She agreed to a quiet look into the case file. What she found in the incident report immediately drew concern. The time of death, as relayed by Theresa, did not line up with field notes from the responding EMT team. According to their documentation, Richard was found cold to the touch, with early-stage lividity, signs that typically indicate a post-mortem interval of 3 to 4 hours. Theresa had claimed she discovered his body at 7:15 a.m. Kinney pulled additional threads. There was no autopsy ordered, but she learned the mortuary had retained routine pre-cremation blood samples, a matter of internal policy, not legal requirement. It was an unusual break, and one Kinney intended to use. The next clue didn't come from the body. It came from a machine. With a subpoena, Kinney gained access to the Halpern's home computer, stored in a small office off the kitchen. Technicians imaged the drive. Within 48 hours, they recovered a sequence of searches conducted in the 2 weeks before Richard's death. Digitalis cardiac symptoms, natural death heart signs, can digitalis be detected post-mortem? There were 12 entries. All typed under Theresa's user login. By March 25, Kinney had enough circumstantial evidence to reclassify the case. She requested full toxicology screening of the preserved blood sample. Results were expedited. On April 1, 1991, the lab returned its report. Richard Halpern's sample contained a lethal concentration of digitoxin, a cardiac glycoside found in foxglove extract. It had not been prescribed. It had not been disclosed. It had been administered. The case was now active. When Detective Laura Kinney reviewed the lab report confirming the presence of digitoxin in Richard Halpern's preserved blood sample, she initiated immediate reclassification of the death as a suspected homicide. Digitoxin, a cardiac toxin derived from digitalis purpurea, has no legitimate presence in modern pharmacology without medical supervision. There was no prescription, no physician's order, and no documented history of herbal supplement use by the decedent. Theresa Halpern became the only person with physical access, opportunity, and apparent motive. Kinney re-examined the timeline. Richard returned home from a business trip on March 9, 2 days before his death. According to travel records, he had attended a supply chain symposium in Louisville and checked out of the downtown Marriott at 11:07 a.m. that Saturday. He made a phone call to Daniel Avery at 15:32 hours, reporting he had just gotten in and was going to rest. That was the last time anyone outside the Halpern household heard from him. Kinney now focused on the weekend window, March 9 through March 11. She returned to the Halpern residence under a new warrant. The home was orderly, undisturbed, even antiseptic in appearance. But in a drawer beneath the sink, behind cleaning supplies, she found a small cardboard shipping box from Greensprig Naturals, a wellness supplement supplier based in Oregon. The box was postmarked February 28. Inside was an empty glass bottle labeled digitalis extract, concentrated tincture, 30 milliliters. Lab tests on residue from the dropper confirmed the presence of digitoxin. Receipts from the Halperns' joint checking account revealed a check payment issued to Greensprig dated February 24. Theresa had written it. Kinney conducted follow-up interviews with 2 of Theresa's acquaintances from church, women she had once met weekly for a study group. One stated that Theresa had become quietly bitter over the past year, often referencing Richard's late nights and his growing disinterest in home life. The other recalled a more pointed remark. She said, "If he ever leaves me, he won't get far. I'll make sure of that." It felt like a joke. But now I wonder. Bank records added weight. On March 12, one day after Richard's death, Theresa transferred $214,000 from his business account into a personal certificate of deposit in her name. She also contacted a realtor about listing the house, claiming she needed to move on. The speed and scope of these financial actions indicated premeditation. But it was the computer, again, that provided the most direct insight into her intent. Recovered browsing logs showed that on March 5, 6 days before Richard's death, Theresa spent over 40 minutes reading a single forum post titled, "What Does a Heart Attack Look Like at Home?" The same day, she opened a word processor and began typing a document titled, "Medical Timeline, Richard." It contained fictional entries, complaints of chest pain, dizziness, and fatigue, none of which were ever made to friends, physicians, or colleagues. The file was last edited at 10:11 p.m. on March 10. Richard was dead less than 9 hours later. Detectives now believe Theresa intended to fabricate a medical history post-mortem, just enough to support a natural cause classification. But the presence of digitoxin nullified that narrative. The Monroe County prosecutor convened a charging review panel on April 4, 1991. Evidence was deemed sufficient for arrest. Surveillance units confirmed Theresa was still in Bloomington. On April 6, just after noon, she was taken into custody outside a small cafe near the courthouse. She did not ask why. Theresa Halpern was arrested at 12:14 hours on April 6, 1991, outside a downtown Bloomington cafe where she had arranged to meet a local realtor. Officers from Monroe County Sheriff's Department approached without visible weapons. She offered no resistance. When informed of the charge, suspicion of homicide in the death of her husband, Richard D. Halpern, her only reply was, "I thought you might come." She was transported to the county facility and booked without incident. During initial processing, she declined to contact a lawyer. Her demeanor remained steady, neither indignant nor fearful. Detective Laura Kinney was authorized to conduct a preliminary interview that same afternoon. The interview was recorded. Transcript summary as follows. Kinney began by asking Theresa to recount the morning of March 11, in her own words. Theresa stated she awoke around 7:10 and found Richard unresponsive beside her. She claimed to have shaken him lightly, and called 911 when he didn't move. She did not attempt CPR. When asked why, she responded, "He was cold. I knew it wouldn't matter." Kinney shifted focus to the weekend leading up to the death. Theresa confirmed Richard had returned from a work trip on Saturday afternoon. "He came in, we had dinner, he went to bed early," she said. When pressed about any symptoms he exhibited, Theresa hesitated. He said he felt tired. A little dizzy. But Richard always pushed through. He didn't like doctors. This echoed the fictional medical notes found on her computer. Kinney knew this was a prepared narrative. Then came the questions about digitalis. Theresa denied knowledge at first, said she'd never heard of it. When shown the empty bottle recovered from her home, she said it must have been something Richard ordered. He took a lot of supplements. Maybe that one, too. But the check in her handwriting, and the order confirmation in her email account, contradicted her. Kinney presented her with the lab report. Digitoxin in Richard's system. Fatal levels. Theresa said nothing for 31 seconds. Then, she folded her arms and said, "I'd like to speak to a lawyer now." Interview was terminated at 14:03 hours. Over the following 48 hours, a court-appointed defense attorney, Rachel Finley, took over representation. Finley filed immediate motions to suppress digital evidence on grounds of warrant scope, motions that would later be denied. Meanwhile, Kinney and her team built the case methodically, a timeline of Theresa's internet searches, financial activity, handwritten receipts, and her rapid efforts to liquidate Richard's estate. A key witness was located during this window, a local pharmacist named Gerald Hayes, who recognized Theresa's face from media coverage. He informed detectives that in early March, roughly a week before the murder, Theresa had asked him for over-the-counter supplements for heart vitality. When he suggested magnesium, she asked specifically about herbal sources of digitalis. Hayes declined to sell her anything and told her it was no longer available without a prescription. But the inquiry was documented in his store log, dated March 2. He kept the note because the question felt off, as he put it. That page, turned over to detectives, would later become a crucial corroborative detail during pre-trial hearings. Meanwhile, the public learned of the arrest on April 8, when the Monroe County prosecutor held a brief press conference confirming that Richard Halpern's death had been reclassified as a homicide by poisoning. Reporters focused on the unusual method and Theresa's lack of remorse. Local headlines ran under titles like "Death by Design" and "Quiet Wife, Silent Killer." Inside the county jail, Theresa remained largely unresponsive. She accepted no visitors. She declined the offer to speak with clergy. Her behavior was described by correctional staff as meticulous and emotionless. It was the same composure she'd shown at the funeral home. The same voice on the 911 call. The arraignment was scheduled for April 15, 1991. Theresa Halpern appeared in Monroe County Circuit Court on April 15, 1991, for her arraignment. The courtroom was filled to capacity, a mix of reporters, attorneys, and local residents drawn by the strangeness of the charge, a woman accused of killing her husband with a botanical poison. Theresa entered in a gray jumpsuit, hands folded. She showed no visible emotion. She entered a plea of not guilty. Prosecutor Michelle Hartley outlined the state's case in brief: deliberate administration of a cardiac toxin, premeditated by financial and digital evidence, and carried out while the victim slept. She described it as a homicide committed with planning, patience, and the intention of silence. Over the next 2 months, both sides filed motions. The defense challenged the seizure of the Halperns' home computer, arguing the search warrant exceeded scope. The judge denied the motion. The search was deemed lawful and specific. The prosecution's evidence list grew steadily. A scanned image of a check signed by Theresa, dated February 24, made payable to Greensprig Naturals. Order confirmation and shipping receipt for digitalis extract, delivered to her address. Digital logs showing 12 searches for cardiac toxins and symptoms between February 21 and March 5. A draft file titled Medical Timeline, Richard, with invented symptoms. A lab report confirming fatal digitoxin concentration in Richard Halpern's bloodstream. A post-mortem interval inconsistent with Theresa's account of discovering the body. The testimony of pharmacist Gerald Hayes, who recalled Theresa inquiring about herbal digitalis, was moved to the center of the state's witness list. So too was Daniel Avery, whose statements regarding Richard's plan to change his life insurance beneficiary framed Theresa's motive: fear of abandonment and loss of financial standing. Meanwhile, Theresa remained held without bond. Her behavior in custody remained unchanged: polite, quiet, disengaged. She made no recorded calls and declined further interviews. By early June, the judge ruled the case would proceed to trial. Jury selection was scheduled for July 29, 1991. On July 10, 1991, just 19 days before jury selection was set to begin, Monroe County Jail medical staff submitted a routine health report to the court. It contained a finding no one on either legal team expected. Theresa Halpern was 10 weeks pregnant. The report was confirmed via blood test and ultrasound. Jail staff had noted a pattern of missed meals and fatigue, initially attributed to stress. A nurse practitioner requested standard lab work. The result came back positive for HCG. Confirmatory testing followed. It was a legal and logistical complication. Theresa had not seen anyone outside of legal counsel since her arrest. She was in solitary housing for much of her detainment. There were no conjugal visits, no unsupervised time with any male staff. The pregnancy had to predate her incarceration. The timeline narrowed the conception to late February or early March, roughly 10 to 14 days before Richard's death. Prosecutors were blindsided. Up to that point, the state's narrative had been clear: Theresa poisoned her husband to escape an unhappy marriage and secure financial control. Now, a biological fact altered the framework. The pregnancy was not just a personal matter, it became a potential motive shift. The defense quickly seized on the revelation. Theresa's attorney filed a notice of intent to amend their strategy. In this version, Theresa had just learned she was pregnant in early March and had not yet told Richard. The defense suggested this was a possible reconciliation moment, that any plan to harm him made no sense when she was carrying his child. It framed her actions in a different light, not as calculated malice, but as tragic coincidence misread as murder. The state was unconvinced. They argued the pregnancy introduced a new possibility, that Theresa had used it as leverage, and when reconciliation failed, or when she feared Richard might leave anyway, she acted. Prosecutor Michelle Hartley did not alter the charge. But she prepared jurors for complexity. In a pre-trial press briefing, she said, "Facts are not feelings. A woman can be pregnant and still commit premeditated murder. The timing does not absolve the evidence." Public interest in the case surged. The story now had layers: poison, betrayal, and an unborn child. Forensic psychologists were brought in by both sides to assess Theresa's mental state and her decision-making capacity during that window. On July 29, jury selection began under tight scrutiny. Theresa Halpern sat silently at the defense table, visibly pregnant now, hands resting on the swell of her abdomen. The jury would not just decide what she had done. They would decide who she was. The trial of State of Indiana versus Theresa A. Halpern opened on August 5, 1991, in Monroe County Circuit Court. By then, public interest had turned national. The courtroom was outfitted with additional seating. Reporters from 3 major news outlets were granted limited access. The charge: murder by intentional poisoning. The context: a wife, a widow, and a mother-to-be. Prosecutor Michelle Hartley opened with precision. The state's argument relied not on motive, but on method. A digital footprint. A chemical profile. A timeline without room for chance. Jurors were shown the digitoxin levels in Richard's preserved blood sample, the falsified symptom notes recovered from Theresa's computer, and her expedited financial activity in the hours after his death. The defense leaned into the pregnancy. Attorney Rachel Finley painted Theresa as emotionally fragile, overwhelmed, and isolated. She suggested that Theresa's purchase of digitalis had been exploratory, part of an anxious, misguided attempt to prepare for health issues after learning she was pregnant. The prosecution countered with the order date, February 24. The estimated date of conception? March 1. The digitalis came first. Key testimony came from Daniel Avery, who described Richard's plans to amend his will and remove Theresa as beneficiary, a move she could not have known about in full, but perhaps suspected. Gerald Hayes, the pharmacist, confirmed her attempt to acquire digitalis locally. The digital evidence laid out her search terms. A full hour of screen captures was entered into evidence. Theresa did not testify. After 6 days of arguments, the jury began deliberation. It returned a verdict in 9 hours. Guilty. 1 count of murder. No recommendation for leniency. On August 13, 1991, Theresa Halpern was sentenced to 45 years in the Indiana Department of Correction, with eligibility for parole after 28. Due to her pregnancy, she was transferred to a secure medical unit at the Indiana Women's Prison in Indianapolis. She gave birth to a healthy boy on November 12, 1991. The child, named Evan Richard Halpern by court-appointed guardians, was placed in the custody of Theresa's sister, Marla Mowbray, under supervised visitation terms. The child would later be told his father died in his sleep. Theresa Halpern never appealed her conviction. She served her sentence quietly, avoided media contact, and worked in the prison library. She was released on parole in 2019, at age 60. She has not spoken publicly since.